The grand archive of Velix Prime had grown, quiet in a way that had nothing to do with the environmental systems or the soundproofing. Of its ancient walls, Kang Do-yoon stood in the center of the lecture hall, having said more in the past hour than he usually said in a month. And he found himself suddenly tired in a way that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion. Young Cathari military attach had asked his questions and received his answers. And now the assembled scholars sat in contemplative silence, processing what they had learned about a species they had dismissed as primitive. Laborer's scholar Vrethix was the first to speak. "I find myself in an unusual position," the tall insectoid admitted, his mandibles clicking slowly. "I came to this symposium as an expert in galactic military history, and I have spent the afternoon being educated by a plumber. I meant no offense to your expertise," Do-hyun said. "None was taken, or rather, much was taken initially. But I believe I have moved past that." Vrethix rose from his seat and descended the steps toward the floor where Do-hyun stood. "You have given us much to consider. But I must ask one final question before we conclude this unexpected lecture." "Ask?" The Cathari scholar stopped a few paces from the human and studied him with compound eyes that had witnessed 3 centuries of academic debate. "You have described human warfare as brutal and pragmatic and effective. You have told us about sieges and starvation and weapons capable of ending worlds. You have admitted that your species would use these tactics again if survival demanded it." "I have." "Then tell me this," Vrethix said slowly. "After all this time, after reaching the stars and joining the galactic community, after choosing peace as you describe it, do you still believe these ancient brutal tactics have value? Or are they simply relics of a more primitive age?" Do-hyun looked at the scholar for a long moment. Then he bent down and picked up his wrench from where he had set it earlier, turning the one tool over in his calloused hands. "You know, what I love about plumbing," he said, conversational extrist. Mandibles clicked in confusion at the apparent change of subject. "I am not certain I follow." "Plumbing is ancient technology," Do-hyun continued. "The Romans had plumbing 2,000 years before my species discovered electricity. The basic principles have not changed in all that time. Water flows downhill. Pressure seeks equilibrium. Seals keep things contained. Simple concepts that were understood before humanity had writing." He held up the wrench. "And this tool, this simple piece of shaped metal, has existed in more or less this form for hundreds of years. Nothing fancy about it. No quantum processors or neural interfaces. Just leverage and grip and the application of force to a specific point. I still do not understand what this has to do with my question." Do-hyun smiled. "Every few decades, some engineer comes up with a clever new tool that is supposed to replace the wrench. Something with motors or sensors or self-adjusting mechanisms. And every time, the new tool fails and gets forgotten. And plumbers go back to using wrenches." He tightened his grip on the tool and gave the nearest pipe fitting an experimental twist. "Do you know why? Because the wrench is simple and reliable." Vrethix guessed. "Because it still works." The words hung in the air. Do-hyun looked up from the pipe and met Vrethix's compound eyes. "Human warfare is the same. We have developed incredible technologies. Weapons that can strike from orbit, drones that can think for themselves, cyber attacks that can cripple nations without a single shot fired. But underneath all of that, the basic principles remain unchanged." He set the wrench down on his toolbox. "Cut supply lines and the enemy starves. Target morale and the enemy loses hope. Make the cost of victory higher than the value of winning and the enemy withdraws. These tactics are older than civilization itself, and they still work. They will always work. Because they target the fundamental vulnerabilities that every species shares." The room was silent. Ambassador Salith rose to her full height, her serpentine form casting a long shadow across the polished floor. I believe I need to send a revised diplomatic assessment to my government, she said quietly. Our current evaluation of human military capabilities appears to be significantly incomplete. That would be wise. Do-hyun agreed without pride or threat in his voice. Junior archivist Plumber had been typing furiously throughout the conversation, his four hands barely able to keep pace with the information he was recording. This may be the most significant academic event of my career, he said. Would you consider returning for next year's symposium as a guest lecturer? Do-hyun laughed, a warm sound that seemed to break some of the tension in the room. I appreciate the offer, but I have pipes to fix on 3 more stations this month, and a contract on a mining platform next quarter. I am just a plumber who talks too much when he should be working. You are considerably more than that, Rithik said, and there was genuine respect in his clicking voice. I have spent my life studying military history, and I have learned more this afternoon than in decades of academic research. You learned what humans are willing to teach, Do-hyun corrected gently. There is much more that we do not speak of, even among ourselves. Some weights are too heavy to share with those who have never carried them. He began gathering his tools, placing each one carefully in his battered toolbox. But I will leave you with one last thought. If you will permit me, please. Ambassador Saleth. Do-hyun closed his toolbox and straightened up, his knees protesting after the long hours of standing. You look at humanity and you see a young species doing simple work, which is exactly what we want you to see. We have learned that quiet competence is more valuable than loud display, and we have learned that being underestimated is its own kind of protection. He picked up his toolbox and walked toward the maintenance access hatch. But remember what I told you today. Remember that the species fixing your water systems and hauling your cargo are the same species that fought 10,000 years of brutal wars and survived. The same species that built weapons capable of ending worlds and chose not to use them. The same species that carries the weight of generational trauma because we refuse to forget what we are capable of. He paused at the hatch and looked back at the assembled scholars one last time. We are not simple, he said. We are just quiet. And there is a difference. Pelham rushed forward before Do-hyun could descend. Wait, please. You never answered why you shared all of this with us. Do-hyun considered the young archivist's question. Because someone needs to know, he said finally. Not as a threat or a warning, but as a bridge. Humanity has spent 2 centuries among the stars being overlooked and underestimated. And mostly we prefer it that way. But sometimes, in the right company, it is good to be seen for what we truly are. He smiled at Pelham. Write it down. Young one, put it in your archives. Maybe someday when humans are not the new species anymore, someone will read your records and understand that we were always more than we appeared. With that, Kang Do-hyun descended through the maintenance hatch, his toolbox clanging against the metal rungs of the ladder. The symposium remained silent long after the sound of his footsteps faded into the ancient pipes beneath their feet. Ambassador Saleth was the first to move, slithering toward a communication terminal with unusual haste. Scholar Rithik returned to his seat but did not resume his lecture, instead staring at the floor grate where the human had first appeared, and Junior Archivist Pelham stood alone in the center of the hall, his data tablet clutched in all 4 hands, knowing that he had just witnessed something that would change the way the galaxy understood humanity somewhere below. In the maze of pipes and conduits that kept the Grand Archive functioning, a human plumber whistled an old song his grandfather had taught him and went back to work. The young Cathari military attaché had asked his question, and now the entire Grand Archive waited for the human plumber to answer. Kang Do-hyun stood very still in the center of the lecture hall, and for a moment he was not there at all but somewhere else entirely, somewhere 60 years in the past, sitting on his grandfather's knee and listening to stories about fire and ash, and the sound of bombs falling. My grandfather was a soldier, he said finally. He served in a war that most humans today have forgotten. Not one of the great conflicts, but a smaller one. Though no war feels small when you're standing in the middle of it. No one spoke or moved. He told me once about a night when his unit was surrounded, cut off from supplies, with no hope of rescue. They had wounded soldiers who would die without medicine, and they had civilians. Families who had fled the fighting and found shelter in the same village. Dahin's voice remained steady, but his hands had begun to shake slightly. The enemy commander sent a message offering terms. Surrender and the soldiers would be taken prisoner. The civilians would be allowed to leave. My grandfather knew it was a lie. He had seen what happened to villages that surrendered. So he gave an order. What order? Palam asked softly. He told his soldiers to dig in, to use every building as a fortress and every street as a killing ground. And he sent a message back to the enemy commander. Dahin paused. He said that for every civilian harmed, his unit would fight for another week. For every wounded soldier executed, they would fight for another month, and when the ammunition ran out, they would fight with knives and rocks in their bare hands, and when the last human soldier fell, the enemy would count their own dead and wonder if the victory was worth the cost. The silence in the hall was absolute. The enemy commander laughed at first. My grandfather told me, but 3 weeks later, when reinforcements finally arrived, the enemy forces withdrew rather than continue the assault. They had taken the village, technically, but the cost had been too high, and there were other villages to conquer. Villages that might surrender more easily. Your grandfather won through stubbornness, Rithik said, and there was no contempt in his voice now. He won because he made the enemy understand something important. Dahin replied, Human beings do not calculate the odds of survival before deciding whether to fight. We fight because there are things worth fighting for, and we keep fighting long after any rational analysis would tell us to stop. Ambassador. Sayla's scales had returned to their normal color, but her eyes remained fixed on the human. You said this was not one of your great wars, yet it clearly affected you deeply. Every war affects us deeply, Dahin said. That is perhaps the most important thing I can tell you. We do not compartmentalize conflict into historical events and move on. We carry our wars with us, in our stories and our memories, and the tremor in our hands when we speak of them. He held up his hands, and the assembled scholars could see that they were indeed shaking. My grandfather has been dead for 30 years, and when I speak of his war, my hands shake as though I were there myself. This is what humans mean when we talk about generational trauma. The weight of history does not rest only on those who lived it. That seems like a weakness. The young military attach observed carefully. To be so affected by events you did not experience, it is a strength, Dahin replied firmly. Because we remember, we choose differently. My generation grew up hearing stories of war from our grandparents, and we decided that we did not want our grandchildren to have such stories to tell. He began pacing again, slower now, his movements heavy with the weight of what he was saying. You asked if humanity would use our ancient tactics again if we were threatened with extinction. The honest answer is yes, we would, not because we want to, not because we have forgotten the cost, but because survival is the first law of any species. And humans have proven throughout our history that we will do whatever is necessary to survive. Whatever is necessary, Salith repeated. That phrase carries a great deal of weight. It does. And I will not pretend otherwise. Dahin stopped pacing and faced the room. We have weapons now that could sterilize entire worlds. We have biological agents that could target specific species while leaving others untouched. We have artificial intelligences that could coordinate attacks across thousands of systems simultaneously. We have all of these things, and we choose not to use them. But the choice exists. Several scholars exchanged alarmed glances. You are being remarkably candid about your species' capabilities, Vrithix observed. I am being honest. Which is not the same thing. You have spent this symposium discussing ancient wars and trying to understand why they ended as they did. I am telling you that the answer has always been simple. Wars end when one side loses the will to continue. And the quickest way to break an enemy's will is to show them what continuation will cost. Deterrence, Pelham said suddenly, his forehands typing rapidly on his tablet. You are describing deterrence theory. The concept that peace can be maintained through the promise of mutual destruction. We call it mutually assured destruction. Dahyun confirmed. MAD, a fitting name for a fitting concept. For most of a century, my species lived under the shadow of weapons that could end all human life. And it was precisely because those weapons were so terrible that they were never used. That seems, Pelham paused, searching for the right word, insane. It is, and it worked. The greatest powers on our world pointed enough nuclear weapons at each other to destroy everything 100 times over. And because both sides knew that using those weapons would mean their own destruction, neither side ever used them. But surely that cannot be a stable arrangement, another scholar protested. The risk of accident or miscalculation alone would be catastrophic. We came close several times, Dahyun admitted. There were moments when the fate of our entire species rested on the judgment of a single person. A radar operator who decided not to trust a computer's warning. A submarine captain who refused to launch without direct confirmation. Ordinary people who chose not to end the world. He smiled. But there was no humor in it. That is what I mean when I say we carry our history with us. Every human knows these stories. We teach them to our children not as distant historical events, but as warnings. Reminders that the capacity for destruction lives in all of us. And only constant vigilance keeps it contained. Ambassador Saleth uncoiled slowly, her full height now visible as she rose from her seated position. I find myself uncertain how to feel about what you have shared, she said. On one hand, your honesty is refreshing. On the other, the implications are deeply troubling. They should be, Dahyun agreed. I am not telling you this to frighten you or to boast about human capabilities. I am telling you because understanding is the first step toward coexistence. What do you mean? Dahyun looked around the room at the assembled scholars, diplomats, and officials. Every species in this room has made assumptions about humanity based on our short time among the stars. You see us fixing pipes and hauling cargo and doing the jobs that other species consider beneath them. And you assume that this is all we are. But we are also the species that clawed our way out of 10,000 years of warfare. The species that stood at the edge of self-destruction and stepped back. The species that carries the weight of our history, precisely so that we can choose a different future. He paused. We are not simple. We are just quiet about our complexity. The young military attach raised his hand again. One more question. If I may, of course. You have described human warfare as brutal and pragmatic and willing to target anything necessary to achieve victory. Yet you also describe your species as having chosen peace. How do you reconcile these two things? Dahyun nodded slowly. That is the question. Is it not? The answer is that peace is not the absence of the capacity for violence. Peace is the choice not to use that capacity every day. Humanity chooses not to deploy the weapons we have built, not to use the tactics we have learned, not to be what we could be if we let go of our restraint. He met the young officer's eyes, and that choice is not a sign of weakness. It is the hardest thing we have ever done. Kang Do-hyun stood in the center of the Grand Archives lecture hall, surrounded by scholars who had come to discuss ancient galactic warfare and now found themselves learning about something far older and far darker. During what we call the medieval period on Earth, he began. Armies would surround a fortified city and wait, sometimes for months, sometimes for years. They did not have the technology to breach strong walls. So they used other methods. What kind of methods? Junior Archivist Pelham asked, his four hands hovering over his data tablet, ready to take notes. They would find every stream and river that flowed into the city and dam them or divert them. They would send soldiers to poison wells with dead animals and human waste. They would burn crops in the surrounding farmland, so there would be nothing to harvest when the siege ended. Destruction of agricultural resources, one scholar murmured. We have similar concepts in our historical records, but we went further, Do-hyun said. And his voice grew quieter. When disease broke out in our siege camps. And it always did, because thousands of soldiers living in close quarters with poor sanitation breed sickness. Our commanders discovered something useful. He paused. And the silence in the hall was absolute. They would take the bodies of the dead, those who had died from plague or fever, and they would load them into catapults and launch them over the walls into the city. Several aliens made sounds of disgust. One scholar near the back actually stood and walked toward the exit before stopping and slowly returning to their seat, unable to look away from the human in the center of the room. This was biological warfare, Do-hyun explained. Using disease as a weapon, we did not understand the science behind it at the time. But we knew that sickness spread, and we knew that a city filled with the dying would surrender faster than one filled with the healthy. That is. Rethix's mandibles clicked rapidly. That is monstrous. Yes, Do-hyun agreed simply. It was. And your species considers these events worthy of study rather than shame, the Kethari scholar demanded. We consider them both, Do-hyun replied. Shame that we did such things, and study so that we understand what we are capable of when survival is at stake. Ambassador. Sayla's scales had shifted to a darker color, which Do-hyun assumed was the Morvani equivalent of distress. Please continue, she said quietly. I need to understand. The wound nodded and resumed his slow pacing. As our technology advanced, so did our methods during a conflict called World War II. Less than 100 years before my species reached space, one nation surrounded a city called Leningrad and maintained a siege for nearly 900 days. 900 days. Pelham repeated in disbelief. How did anyone survive? Many did not. Over 1 million civilians died, mostly from starvation and cold. The attackers did not need to fire a single shot inside the city. They simply waited and let hunger do their work for them. People ate sawdust and leather and worse things I will not describe. The hall had grown very still. Even the environmental systems seemed to be running quieter than before. But here is what I want you to understand, Do-hyun said, stopping his pacing and facing the assembled scholars directly. The city did not fall, despite everything. Despite the starvation and the disease and the bombs that fell every day. The defenders held on for 900 days until relief forces broke through. Why? Someone asked from the back of the room. Why would they endure such suffering rather than surrender? Because they knew what surrender meant. The attackers had made clear that they intended not just conquest but extermination, when the alternative is death. People find strength they did not know they had. Do-hyun let that statement hang in the air for a moment before continuing. This is what your Dominion commanders at Korath Station did not understand. They approached the siege as a military operation with clear rules and expected outcomes. But siege warfare breaks those rules. It targets not armies but populations, not strength but will. And the defenders always have one advantage that attackers can never take away. What advantage? Rethix asked. And for the first time, his voice held something other than contempt. They are fighting for their homes, their families, everything they know. The attackers are fighting for objectives written on a strategy document. That difference matters more than any technology. Pelham's hands had stopped moving over his tablet. You are saying that the hegemony, wars ended in stalemate, not because of strategic failures, but because neither side was willing to wage true siege warfare. I am saying that your ancestors fought with honor, and honor has a cost. The Dominion could have won at Karth if they had been willing to turn the station into a tomb. But that would have required them to be something they were not. And humans, Salith said slowly. Humans would have been willing. Do-Hyun met her eyes. We have been willing before. We have starved cities and burned nations and used weapons that poisoned the land for generations. We are not proud of these things, but we do not pretend they did not happen. Then why tell us? Rethix demanded. Why share these horrors with species who have moved beyond such barbarism? Have you, though? The question was gentle, not accusatory, but it struck the room like a physical blow. The hegemony wars killed how many? Do-Hyun asked. No one answered. I read the memorial plaque in the entrance hall, he continued. 14 billion casualties over 60 years of conflict. 14 billion people dead because two civilizations could not find a way to end their war. He shook his head slowly. My species has fought terrible wars. And we have done terrible things. But we also learned, eventually, that the fastest way to end a war is to make the enemy understand that continuing will cost them everything. Not just soldiers and ships, but cities and futures and hope itself. That sounds like a threat, Rethix said. It is a lesson, Do-Hyun replied. The same lesson humanity learned after we built weapons that could destroy entire planets. We looked at what we had created, and we realized that some victories are too expensive to pursue. Ambassador Salith shifted her coils thoughtfully. You are saying that humanity abandoned these brutal tactics? No, Do-Hyun said. And something in his voice made several scholars lean back in their seats. I am saying we remember them. Every human child learns about the sieges and the famines and the weapons that burned cities to ash. We remember because forgetting would be the greatest danger of all. Why? Pelham asked softly. Do-Hyun turned to face the young archivist. Because the moment we forget what we are capable of is the moment we become capable of it again. We carry our history like a weight, not to drag us down, but to remind us why we chose a different path. Young Kethari, wearing the uniform of a military attach, raised his hand hesitantly. May the first ask a question. Of course, the young officer glanced at Rethix, then back at Do-Hyun. If humanity was threatened, truly threatened with extinction, would you use these tactics again? The hall fell silent. Every scholar, every diplomat, every archivist leaned forward to hear the answer. Do-Hyun looked at the young officer for a long moment. And when he spoke, his voice was very quiet. That is exactly the right question to ask, he said. And I will give you an honest answer. The symposium had not officially paused, but every scholar in the Grand Archive had stopped speaking to watch the human plumber climb up through a maintenance hatch and step onto the polished floor of the lecture hall. Kang Do-Hyun felt every one of his 52 years as he straightened his back and faced the assembled academics. His coveralls were stained with rust and lubricant. His hands were rough from decades of manual labor, and he was acutely aware that he did not belong in this place of fine robes and advanced degrees. But his grandfather had not raised him to back down from a challenge. Constantinople, he repeated, looking around at the confused alien faces. A city on my homeworld that stood for over 1,000 years as one of the greatest fortresses humanity ever built. We are discussing galactic warfare, Scholar Rethix interrupted, his mandibles clicking with barely concealed contempt. Not primitive terrestrial conflicts. You are discussing a siege that failed, Do-Hyun replied calmly. And I am telling you about sieges that succeeded. Do you want to learn or do you want to argue? A sharp intake of breath came from several scholars at the human's directness. Ambassador Salith made a sound that might have been approval. Please continue, she said, her serpentine form settling into a more comfortable position. I find myself genuinely curious. Do-Hyun nodded his thanks to her. Constantinople, was besieged dozens of times over its history by armies with superior numbers, advanced weapons, and brilliant commanders. Yet, it stood for century after century. Do you know why? Superior defensive technology, one scholar offered. Defensive position, suggested another. No, Dahyun said. It had strong walls, yes. But walls can be broken, and had a good position. But positions can be overcome. Constantinople survived because its attackers kept trying to win the wrong way. He walked slowly toward the center of the room, and the crowd of scholars parted to let him pass. They would bring their armies and their siege weapons and throw themselves against the walls again and again, trying to breach the defenses through strength and technology. Exactly like your Dominion forces at Kara Station. The situations are hardly comparable, Rethix protested. The Dominion fleet possessed quantum targeting systems, capable of pinpoint strikes on any weakness in the station's defenses. And yet the station held for 9 months, Dahyun said. Why? That is what we are trying to determine. No. You are trying to find a complicated answer because you cannot accept the simple one. Dahyun stopped in the middle of the lecture floor and looked up at the assembled scholars. The Dominion commanders treated the siege like a puzzle to be solved with superior firepower and advanced calculations. But a siege is not a puzzle. It is a patience contest. And the side that is willing to wait and squeeze always wins. Junior Archivist Pelham raised one of his 4 hands. What do you mean by squeeze? I mean that you do not defeat a fortified position by attacking it. Dahyun explained, you defeat it by making life inside unbearable. You cut the supply line so food runs short. You poison the water sources so the defenders get sick. You block the waste disposal so disease spreads. You wait until they are starving and desperate. And then you offer them a way out. Several scholars shifted uncomfortably in their seats. That sounds, Pelham began. Then hesitated. Cruel. War is cruel, Dahyun said simply. The only question is whether you want a short cruelty or a long one. The attackers at Constantinople, who tried to breach the walls, caused years of suffering and thousands of deaths. The ones who simply waited and squeezed ended conflicts in months with far fewer casualties on both sides. You are suggesting that the Dominion forces should have ignored military targets entirely, Ambassador Saleth said slowly, and focused on making the station uninhabitable. I am suggesting that they should have thought like plumbers, instead of admirals. This drew a few sounds of genuine laughter from the audience. In my work, I have learned that every system has pressure points, Dahyun continued. And the people who built those systems usually know where they are. A station like Korath would have water recycling, just like this archive, and air filtration and thermal regulation and waste processing, all critical, all vulnerable, all completely ignored by commanders who only thought about shields and weapons. Our warfare traditions emphasize honor in combat, Rethix said stiffly. Targeting civilian infrastructure would be considered beneath the dignity of a proper military force. Your warfare traditions lost the siege, Dahyun replied, without any malice in his voice. 9 months of orbital bombardment and assault runs and tactical maneuvering, all for nothing. When a single ship could have parked itself near the supply routes and waited, but the defenders would have surrendered eventually regardless. Another scholar protested. They were outnumbered and outgunned. Were they, though? Dahyun looked around the room with genuine curiosity. In 9 months of siege, with all that advanced technology, how many supply runs did the Dominion forces intercept? The scholars looked at each other. Pelham consulted a data tablet with 2 of his hands. According to the historical records, the Dominion intercepted approximately 12% of incoming supply shipments to Kora Station. 12%, Dahyun repeated. So 88% of supplies got through, which means the defenders were never truly under siege at all. Your ancestors were so focused on the military victory that they let cargo ships slip past while they calculated optimal attack vectors. A heavy silence fell over the hall. "This is..." Rethix began, then stopped, his mandibles clicking rapidly in what Do-Hyun had learned to recognize as agitation. "This is obvious." Do-Hyun finished for him. "I know. That is what I was laughing about earlier. You have built an entire academic discipline around analyzing why complex strategies failed, when the answer is that simple strategies were never tried." Ambassador Salith uncoiled slightly, her scales catching the light as she moved. "You speak as though human military history is filled with such examples." "It is. Then tell us more." Do-Hyun looked at the serpentine diplomat. Trying to read her expression, she seemed genuinely interested rather than mocking. And something in her eyes reminded him of his grandfather, when the old man would lean forward during a story that mattered. "Are you certain you want to hear this?" he asked. "Because human warfare is not a comfortable subject. We did not fight with honor or dignity. We fought to win. And sometimes what we did to win was terrible. I believe I speak for many here when I say that comfort is less important than understanding," Salith replied. And murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Even Vrithix, despite his obvious displeasure, did not object. Do-Hyun took a deep breath. "Very well," he said. "Let me tell you about some of the things my species learned in 10,000 years of killing each other. But I warn you now, you will not like all of what you hear." He began to pace slowly, the way his grandfather used to when telling stories that had no happy endings. "We will start with something simple," he said. "Disease." Several scholars leaned forward with interest. None of them were prepared for what came next. The Grand Archive of Vilix Prime stood as one of the most respected academic institutions in the known galaxy. And today, its marble halls echoed with the voices of scholars from dozens of worlds who had gathered for the Centennial War Studies Symposium. Kang Do-Hyun did not care about any of this. He was 52 years old. His knees hurt from decades of crawling through tight spaces, and he had been hired to fix the water recycling system that ran beneath the symposium hall. Not to listen to aliens debate ancient battles, yet here he was, lying on his back under a corroded pipe junction, listening to every word whether he wanted to or not. The Hegemony Wars remain the most studied conflict in galactic history, a tall insectoid scholar named Rethix was saying to the assembled audience, his mandibles clicking with academic authority. And yet we still cannot agree on why the Dominion forces failed to achieve victory despite their overwhelming technological superiority. Do-Hyun twisted his wrench and felt ancient rust give way beneath his grip above him, through a floor grate. He could see the shadows of various alien forms shifting in their seats. The predictive algorithms employed by Dominion fleet commanders should have guaranteed success, another voice added. This one belonging to a serpentine creature whose scales caught the light as she moved. Their quantum-enhanced battle computers could calculate outcomes across 17,000 variables simultaneously, and yet they lost, Vrithix replied with clear frustration in his clicking voice. Every model suggested victory, but the Kara station siege ended in complete withdrawal after 9 standard months. Do-Hyun smiled to himself and kept working. Had heard academics talk like this before, always on stations and ships where he was called to fix what others had neglected, always discussing grand theories while the practical reality sat rusting beneath their feet. A young 4-armed alien named Pelham, who wore the modest robes of a junior archivist, raised one of his hands nervously. Perhaps the models failed to account for psychological factors, he suggested. The defenders of Kara Station showed unusual resistance to standard intimidation protocols. Psychological factors are accounted for in all modern strategic analysis. Rethix dismissed the young scholar with a wave of his segmented limb. The Cathari War Academy has spent 3 centuries refining our understanding of combat psychology across all known species. All known species. the serpentine ambassador named Selith repeated thoughtfully. But the humans had not yet been contacted during the Hegemony Wars. Had they? Dohyun paused in his work. The humans are irrelevant to this discussion, Rethix stated firmly. They are a young species, barely spacefaring for 2 of their centuries, with no significant military presence in galactic affairs and certainly no understanding of strategic warfare at this level. Several scholars made sounds of agreement. Their contribution to galactic society has been primarily in labor and trade, another academic added. Useful for manual work and cargo transport, but hardly the sort of species to offer insight into the complexities of interstellar warfare. Dohyun felt his smile widen despite himself. He knew he should stay quiet and finish his work and collect his payment and move on to the next job on the next station. But something about the casual dismissal in their voices reminded him of his grandfather, a man who had survived things these academics could not imagine. Chuckled softly, the sound carried through the floor grate. And suddenly the great hall above fell silent. What was that? Rethix demanded. His compound eyes scanning the room, Pelham pointed toward the floor with 2 of his arms. I believe it came from below. Scholar Rethix, from the maintenance access. Dohyun sighed and slid out from under the pipes, standing slowly and brushing rust from his worn coveralls. Through the grate, he could see dozens of alien faces now staring down at him with expressions ranging from curiosity to irritation. My apologies, Dohyun said, his voice carrying clearly through the openings in the floor. I did not mean to interrupt your symposium. You are the human plumber, Rethix stated rather than asked. The one contracted to repair the water systems. That is correct. And what exactly did you find amusing about our sacred academic discourse? Dohyun considered his options. He could apologize again and return to his work and let these scholars continue their debate. Or he could say what he was actually thinking. His grandfather had always told him that staying silent when you knew something others did not was its own kind of cowardice. I meant no disrespect. Dohyun began carefully, but I have been listening to your discussion for the past hour, and I cannot help but notice that you are making this much more complicated than it needs to be. Ripple of murmurs passed through the assembled scholars. Rethix's mandibles clicked in what Dohyun had learned to recognize as the Kethari expression of condescension. Is that so? The scholar replied. Please, enlighten us, maintenance worker. Share your expertise on strategic warfare that has somehow eluded the finest military minds in the galaxy for 300 years. I am just a plumber, Dohyun said, raising his hands in a gesture of humility. But where I come from, we have a saying about simple solutions. And what saying would that be when all your fancy theories fail? Try hitting it with a wrench. Silence followed his words. Then a few sounds that might have been alien ladder Rethix was not among those amused. This is precisely what I meant about human intellectual limitations, the scholar announced to the room. They reduce everything to crude physical action because they lack the cognitive capacity for true strategic thinking. Maybe, Dohyun admitted. Or maybe we just learned a long time ago that the simple answer is usually the right one. Ambassador Selith leaned forward, her serpentine body coiling with interest. You said we were overcomplicating matters, she said, her voice smooth and curious rather than mocking. What did you mean by that? Dohyun looked up at the assembled scholars, at their fine robes and their advanced technology and their centuries of accumulated knowledge. And he thought about his grandfather sitting in a small apartment, telling stories of a war that these aliens would call primitive. You want to know why the siege of Karth Station failed, he said. We have been debating that question for the entirety of this symposium. Rethix replied impatiently. Then let me ask you something simple, Dohyun said. During the siege, what was the water supply situation for the defenders? The scholars exchanged confused glances. Water supply, Pelham repeated. What does that have to do with fleet movements and battle calculations? What about ventilation? Do-hyun continued. Waste disposal, food storage, medical supplies. The temperature inside the station when life support ran at minimum to conserve power. Breathix made a dismissive sound. Those are civilian concerns, not military matters. The domain of logistics officers and supply clerks, not strategists. Do-hyun nodded slowly, and for the first time, his expression lost its humble apologetic quality. That, he said, is exactly why you lost. The hall fell completely silent. Even Breathix seemed momentarily at a loss for words. I am sorry, Ambassador Saleth said, leaning even further forward. But I would very much like to hear you explain what you mean by that. Do-hyun looked at his wrench, then back up at the faces, staring down at him through the grate. Have any of you ever heard of a city called Constantinople? He asked. Nobody answered. Do-hyun set down his tools and brushed off his hands. Then perhaps you should all sit down, he said, because I am about to teach you something that your War Academy seems to have missed.